Welcome, everybody. I said, how's it going, everybody? In New Orleans, we like a little call and response, you know? Thank you, Brian, for inviting me to be part of this. Thank you, Amy, for what I can only imagine to be an unbelievable amount of logistics. If my emails to you are any indication how much work you had to do. But I'm really happy to be here. And like Christoph said, I may be bringing a different set of methods here. My work is ethnographic, and we'll hear a little bit of stories of some parents and students and teachers at an after-school program called The Roots of Music that I helped found with the director, Derek Tabb, back in 2007, and has been volunteering ever since, and it's an amazing group of people. But I'm also bringing in my interest in political theory. So there's a kind of strain throughout the panel of really, I would say, structural racism. But what I'm about to talk about is probably pretty different, very contemporary, very musical, and really getting into the horror show of public education in New Orleans. And I just wanted to mention, these are little excerpts from my book that I've stitched together. It's probably a little messy, unless I was really zinging it on the train ride yesterday, and then it's going to be great. But the theme I'm getting into here is resilience. And I had no idea that that was one of the themes of this conference. So I'm offering a critique of resilience. I think I'm the first person at the conference to actually engage with resilience. So you're getting the critique right out the gate. But I hope it spurs some conversation throughout the day. Great. Let me just go ahead and read. Like I said, this is some passages from a book I'm working on right now. In 2015, on the 10th anniversary of Katrina, Mayor Mitch Landrieu convened a conference entitled Resilient New Orleans. The mood was triumphant, with the mayor touting all the redevelopment as evidence, quote, of America's best comeback story. He announced a new job in City Hall, the Chief Resilience Officer, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. You really can't make some of this shit up. Funded by the Rockefeller Foundation as part of their 100 Resilient Cities initiative to, quote, build resilience to physical, social, and economic challenges. Partnerships with the likes of Deutsche Bank, Swiss Re, and the Walmart Foundation pointed to something not discussed at the conference. Resilience is big business. It creates profit and philanthropic tax breaks for institutions that target the effects of challenges while obscuring their structural causes, thus ensuring the challenges keep coming. This is the Janus face of resilience, say critics like Tracy Washington, an attorney and co-founder of the Louisiana Justice Institute, who actually was on a panel at this conference, and she said, "Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you can do something else to me." Anthropologist Roberto Barrios wrote a book about the uneven process of recovery, colleague at UNO of Rachel and Brian, about the process of recovery after environmental disasters, including undocumented Latino workers who were essential to the rebuilding effort, but were vulnerable to everything from wage theft to deportation. But he also has a separate article focusing specifically on resilience and its relation to environmental crises. And he kind of, I would say, debunks the mythology of resilience in a way that echoes and gives credence to the quote we just saw from Tracy Washington. So now quoting him, he writes, "Difficulties in recovery are often not the result of an absence in capacities on the part of affected populations. They are often the result of systematic structural violence that would undermine any community's ability to recover." And then he goes on to give examples of Black and Brown Louisianians who face hurricanes made stronger and more frequent by the cancer-causing emissions from 160 petrochemical plants along the Mississippi River, which we just heard about, and in another passage of indigenous communities who've been forced to resettle from their land
along the Gulf of Mexico due to coastal erosion and rising sea levels. I think Rachel may have done a little work on that as well. Quoting Barrios again, if resilience is the capacity of a system to deal with or adapt to hazardous circumstances, then the site of intervention are not small communities like Ile de Jean-Charles, Louisiana, but the petrochemical companies and US federal agencies whose practices have created the vulnerability of Louisiana's coastal populations. He goes on, the concept of, and I think this is the takeaway, the concept of resilience does not mitigate disasters, but serves as a mechanism for the maintenance of the system that creates them. So just switching gears a little bit with that as a kind of backdrop, I moved to New Orleans 25 years ago, this August, as a sound engineer and a radio producer. So my research is really not on environmental crises, but the lives of musicians, like Christoph said at the beginning, who sort of feed audiences with the bounty of New Orleans musical culture, but they themselves are mostly starved of material resources. And I talked about that in my first book, which focused on the structural problem, I would say, of housing mostly, how Black musicians were doubly displaced. First as evacuees from the floods of Katrina, and then as victims of gentrification and the post-Katrina development boom, which coincided with a massive descaling of the public housing that Ryan just talked about. But I'm not sure if you made this point, really operating, I would say right now at about 1/10 of the capacity of pre-Katrina, right? So an incredible decimation of low-income housing that all of us have witnessed very, very recently. This current book is about how kids in New Orleans learn to play music. It came about because musicians, you would get into the lore of New Orleans music where you really get the sense that, trombone shorty comes out of the womb going da da da, because they grow up in this immersion of authentic local culture. But I think there's a couple institutions that get left out too often, one of which is the church, which we're going to hear about today. I would say another is music teachers and formal education. You almost never hear that reference, but when you talk to musicians, they just tell you all the time, oh, I had this teacher, Joe Torregano, et cetera, who gave me my first horn. So that was the original impetus for this study many years ago. And because of that, I focus on a different structural problem than housing, public education, which was also drastically restructured following Hurricane Katrina. The state dissolved the teachers' union and the entire school system, creating the country's only non-system of independently run charter schools. Education as a public good and a public right is essentially over in the city. It's been replaced with what gets called an education marketplace where corporations that mask as nonprofit charter schools run experiments on kids like organisms in a petri dish. I hope the connection to the resilience concept I began with is clear. Kids in schools, as well as musicians on the streets and in the clubs, navigate these perilous structures that limit their social mobility, and then the people putting a boot on their neck are instructing them to be resilient in order to survive. So I'm going to be a little more specific now in showing how mythologies of resilience govern kids' lives in these schools, especially the behavioral rules and codes of conduct in these charter schools. And then in music education, specifically the tradition of marching bands that I've been involved with for a little while now, very much as an outsider. I play guitar, not a horn or a drum. Guitar is a very lonely instrument in New Orleans. New Orleans is 60% Black, but most students attend so-called apartheid schools that are over 95% Black and have rigid zero tolerance policies for every conceivable behavioral rule, right? So for instance, in most of these schools in New Orleans now, kids must stand silently with heads down in the hallways They have to clap at assemblies. They have to make eye contact with teachers. They have to pick up and put down their pencils on command or face, detentions and a kind of point system that accrues to them over the year. The largest of these, what are called charter management organizations, is KIPP, K-I-P-P. The largest, which went so far as to design a character growth card to grade students on 24 behavioral skills. The one I want to draw your attention to, if you can see it on the second black line, is GRIT, which essentially means resilience, sort of self-improvement through resilience. Something I would say many parents, as a parent, would support, right? But there's a hidden racial logic to KIPP's emphasis on grit, and that's that kids of color have a special need to reform themselves, and the solution is to correct those individual behaviors without addressing the institutional inequalities. So I see these environmental and educational institutions as linked in their ideology. In her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, education scholar Bettina Love urges what she calls the abolition of educational norms that constrain what she calls dark children, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and especially Black students. She flips the pathologizing script of grit. She has a whole chapter on grit by invoking the tragedy of Trayvon Martin, how the schoolboy was fatally shot by an off-duty security officer. For those of you not up on recent American politics, this was the lever that launched the Black Lives Matter movement when the homicide was ruled justifiable because this unarmed child posed a threat to an armed guard who was off duty, right? Quoting her, "Dark students being gritty, full of excitement and energy, reciting self-improvement statements and displaying social and emotional intelligence does not stop them from being killed in the streets or spirit murdered in the classroom." She advocates for redirecting power and resources toward protecting students' potential, and she identifies art as a primary area for transformative growth, which I forgot to write here, but of course within the charter school movement, the STEM classes and to a lesser extent English language classes are very, very important because that's the mechanism of statewide assessment, and then the schools get assessed on those metrics. So art has really been, and music have really been marginalized in these schools. But Bettina Love writes, "A class in visual art, creative writing, or music offers more than, quote, a mode of expression. It is how dark children make sense of this unjust world and a way to sustain who they are as they recall and remember in the midst of chaos what it means to thrive." So for Bettina Love and other progressive educators, art instruction offers a space of heart, a safe space, soft and nurturing, an antidote to the hardness, the grittiness, and the darkness. And that's a little bit of a setup to marching band, which is really something quite different. It's a little clip from a great movie called The Whole Gritty City about marching bands in New Orleans. Marching band education in New Orleans offers creative expression and social bonding, but it also enforces discipline and obedience. Band is celebrated as a form of culturally responsive education, which abolitionists advocate as a path to liberation from these structures we're talking about. But it also instills levels of grit that school administrators seek in raising more controlled children of color. So I'll turn now to band, which is this main subject of this book I'm working on with the great photographer and filmmaker Abdul Aziz, and we'll see a little bit of his work in a minute. New Orleans is in the middle of a marching band belt that stretches from Florida to Texas, where high school bands emulate those of colleges like Southern University, Grambling University, two historically Black colleges in Louisiana. These are what are called show bands, are the main attraction at football games and the halftime shows, and also in New Orleans at Mardi Gras parades. If you've ever seen the bands marching in between the floats. They can take up an entire city block with trombones, trumpets, mellophones, baritones, saxophones, clarinets, flutes, and then snare drum, tenor drum, bass drum, cymbal, sousaphone, often with the auxiliary team up front of the dancers and the cheerleaders and the flag twirlers and the drum majors. Since the 1960s, it was this band, and specifically this band director, Edwin Hampton, little typo there, at the St. Augustine High School, that set the local standard for marching bands in the city. This is like known information to many people in this room, unquestionable. The school was founded by the Josephite Order of Catholics, of course, in 1951, and has remained segregated by race and gender. It's the city's most heralded training ground, specifically for young Black men. Band director Edwin Hampton became a local legend by desegregating Mardi Gras in 1967, leading the first Black band in the Carnival Day parade of the Crew of Rex, which is, of course, officially mayor for the day in the city of New Orleans on Mardi Gras. His was not a path of revolutionary insurrection of the type advocated for by Bettina Love, I just mentioned a minute ago, but of steely-eyed accommodationism, cultivating a disciplined band of kind of musical excellence and discipline that demanded inclusion into these white supremacist spaces of, in this case, civil rights era Mardi Gras. Here's a little clip from one of the founding band members reflecting on the ideology that Hampton instilled in the students.
And we recognize that there was something endearing about military discipline. So we tried to instill this in the kids. A marching band is really a takeoff from the military. So we wanted that aspect to be a major part of our playing. After all, playing music requires a lot of discipline in itself. But the marching aspect of it was just an extension of that whole thing.
I would give this to credit here to Hampton himself, totally, because he wanted a precision military type of operation, and that's what he got. That's what St. Augustine became known for. When St. Augustine band came marching down the street, everybody said, "Oh."
So it's really no overstatement to say that St. Aug still sets the standard to which every New Orleans band aspires, with all the gritty implications of race and gender that entails. The Roots of Music, an after-school program for middle school kids, proudly accepts the nickname Little St. Aug. They play popular radio tunes with syncopated rhythms, funky tuba riffs, loud, strident horn parts, characteristic of the more advanced high school and college bands. And they've led by a trio of drum majors who step, dance, and twirl in the Southern style. That's, of course, roots at the Mardi Gras parade that was founded by the great drummer Derek Tabb from the Rebirth Brass Band. In the 1980s, Derek joined the Andrew J. Bell Junior High School Band under the director of Donald Richardson, another famous figure in this world. Like Edwin Hampton at St. Aug, Richardson was a taskmaster, and Derek credits him with luring him away from a life of selling drugs and crime that he says he was headed on. As Derek says, he was strict and he saved me. This is a recurring theme you hear from a lot of adults reflecting on what band taught them, this discipline, this resilience. With the Roots of Music, Derek takes on this role of the disciplinarian, demanding straight lines and high steps, calling students to attention with blasts of the whistle, meting out push-outs as punishment. You can see, unlike St. Og, Roots of Music, like all the other bands, teaches boys and girls. Girls play historically male-dominated instruments like drums and lower brass, even as they must conform to the kind of hyper-masculine gender norms of band. Also, unlike St. Og, I should emphasize, Roots does not permit corporal punishment. But obedience is maintained, as you can see, through this kind of militaristic hierarchy with Derek, an old friend of mine, at the top. And we talk about this stuff all the time. And in another presentation, you'd be hearing directly from him. But I want to get to one of the family members at Roots quickly. Hovering over my own claims for marching band education as life-giving is the problem of grit as a kind of disciplinary paddle for enforcing conformity. Just compare images of kids playing instruments and wearing band uniforms, which are so celebrated in American culture, against the stereotype of the hoodie invoked in justifying the killing of Trayvon Martin. Discipline is critical to the widespread adulation of band kids because public performances meet expectations of a kind of disciplined Blackness, not docile, but gritty, virile, but never wild or wilding, right? Which is unacceptable. Therein lies the problem with resilience. It is valued by different sectors of American society. It is perhaps the basis of the American dream. There is something of a consensus that grit is necessary for success and for survival. And so I want to close by reconnecting this resilience concept to the environmental problems I started with. Through the experiences of one of the families at the Roots of Music, Halil and Harlem, and their father, Herb Vaughn. So Halil is right there. And this is some of the beautiful footage that Aziz is shooting as we work on this together. Harlem will appear here, and the glasses on the left. That's Herb with the parents' booster club outside as they're preparing to board the buses for a Mardi Gras parade. So why am I talking about this family? After high school, Herb worked as a welding inspector for an oil refinery. And in his 30s, he developed lymphoma. In an interview, he told me and Aziz of his determination to beat cancer for the sake of these children we just saw. I hope this comes through.
When I was going through that, I saw their faces. They were nervous at times, but it was a scary thing, I guess. But, you know, it could be worse. And, you know, I love my kids. I want to be here for them. So I did not pray that I get to see them grow up. You know, yeah. I mean, just lay down and give up.
So Herb undertook a chemotherapy regimen, went back to work, but the tumor in his chest returned 9 months later. So he received this very progressive and very expensive stem cell transplant at MD Anderson, which is the best cancer treatment hospital in the US in Houston. He really he's so effusive, he's just beyond appreciative for every waking moment. And he chalks up his survival to a faith in God, to running, to exercising at the gym, to organic food. I run into him at the market a lot, giving up meat, and to a positive mindset. In other words, he sees himself as resilient, right? But based on the stories he shared with me, he knows resilience is no guarantee of survival. So that here's another story.
You know, some people, this one girl, she had the same cancer. She got medicated, and the cancer rejected. And we give her the procedure. So, is it about caring or is it about money? If you care, you would help her.
So Herb told me he was very well paid at the refinery and was lucky they provided him with very good health insurance. but he knows the refinery is willing to pay this price because of the risks they're putting their employees through. Last clip.
Every time, I felt after a while, I'm getting ill, and it was like, the pay is more like a hazard pay. That's how I feel, age, because, it is, the owners, they like, so they're doing it. Yeah, it's awesome.
So I'm going to end there. I think the task ahead of me is to try to stitch together this story that relates directly to the environment with the sort of musical and political aspects that I've been tying these strands together through the resilience concept, where the militaristic codes of marching band nevertheless become kind of a lifeline for kids and their parents. And that's where Herb ended our interview by saying, he lives to see his kids in these bands. Thanks.